Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from in the world. I'm Nikki Roach, I'm the president of CIWEM, and I'm delighted to be chairing today's session, COVID-19 and the water sector, organisational resilience for a green recovery. There's a UK focus to this event, but I'm really sure that what we'll hear will be relevant in a global context. We've got some fantastic speakers to hear from who I'll introduce properly in a moment, and today's session will be recorded and available after the event on the CIWEM website. The ways in which the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted on the water sector have been many and varied, from profound changes in working arrangements for many employees in the sector to changes in water consumption patterns and energy load for wastewater treatment. The pandemic's had wide and significant impacts that need to be managed. In the UK, lockdown in spring 2020, followed by an easing of restrictions across the summer and then a tightening of rules again through the autumn as cases have increased, has presented varying conditions for the sector to work through. Far from the acute shocks that the sector most frequently manages, COVID-19 presents a varying and longer term set of resilience challenges. And at the same time, the water sector has been targeted by government as one that can help catalyse a green recovery, bringing forward investment plans to energise the economy. Research conducted by CIWEM, the University College Dublin, University of Exeter, University of West England, sheds a light on the detail of these initial experiences. The research is continuing in a second phase to understand how the sector can apply lessons from the initial impact and experience from other resilience challenges to bring new and lasting improvements to planning and operation that will drive a green recovery. Today, we're going to share the findings and themes identified by that research and discuss how progress can be delivered in particular areas of need. We'll be using the Zoom Q&A function to capture any questions, so pop yours in there and vote up questions others have posed if you like them. And we'll put the most popular ones to our panel. And if you want to address your question to a particular speaker, then it would really help me if you can pop their name at the start of the question. We've got 6 fantastic speakers and they're going to each talk for around 10 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes of Q&A at the end, and we'll finish just before 11 o'clock. So for those of us that might want to participate in the minute silence at 11 o'clock to remember the 4 workers at Avonmouth who tragically lost their lives last week, then we can do that. So without further ado, our first speaker. I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Sarah Cotterill from University College Dublin. Sarah is an assistant professor in civil engineering at University College Dublin, and she completed an engineering doctorate at Newcastle University with Northumbrian Water in 2016 as part of the Stream Industrial Doctoral Centre. And that's where she met some of the co-authors in the CIWEM study. She was awarded a Fulbright All Disciplines Scholar in 2017 to carry out research at the Pennsylvania State University. And after this, she worked as an innovation manager for the Water Hub at Durham University before moving to Ireland for her current role. So a very warm welcome to Sarah.
Thanks, Nikki. So I'm just going to firstly apologise for being one of those people who leaves their camera off, but I had a tooth extraction this week and my face and mouth isn't quite coordinating with my brain as I would like it to. By now, the COVID-19 pandemic doesn't really need an introduction anymore. This slide shows some of the headlines early on in the pandemic in the UK once the nationwide lockdowns had been implemented and panic had set in. So people stocked up on essentials, the shops soon ran out of toilet paper, and people started to buy alternatives. They were unaware that these items can cause damage downstream to downstream infrastructure and are potentially unflushable. But at the same time, the rapid implementation of the lockdown led to mass disposal of beverages from the hospitality industries. So beer and milk were poured down the drain as pubs shut and cafes closed. And this was a threat of an unknown scale. And my colleagues and I wanted to find out how resilient the sector was to such a threat. Resilience is essentially an assessment of a system when that system is subject to a threat. So we began by looking at the threat posed by COVID-19. But as you'll see later in the presentation, we have looked in a more recent study about multiple threats that have happened and occurred simultaneously. So in May, the research team and I co-designed a survey with CIWEM and also a panel of sector experts, and this included 7 UK water companies and 3 consultancies. So we got ethical approval and sent out the survey for responses for about 2 weeks at the end of May and the beginning of June. And during this time, we received about 500 responses. So we designed the survey to capture the challenges in a chronological manner, but we also wanted them to fit with the Safe and Sure Resilience framework to see if there had been any impacts and any consequences. So we looked at 4 pillars, which are shown on this slide: mitigation, adaptation, coping, and learning. And we wanted to find out how prepared the sector had been, what adaptation mechanisms had been deployed to respond, how individuals and organisations had coped, but also what lessons had been learnt so far, acknowledging that we were only part of the way through the pandemic. So the questionnaire was structured in 2 halves. The first part sought to find out about employees' experiences, and the second part asked about their perceptions of organisational response. So our findings suggested that ordinarily about 10% of the sector routinely worked from home, but overnight this changed to over 80%. There was some evidence to suggest that different groups of people were coping and managing this differently. So fewer women reported an increase in productivity than men, but more women reported a decrease in well-being than men. Despite these differences, individuals were coping with and adapting to the pandemic in a variety of different ways. Some struggled to balance care responsibilities with work, others struggled with isolation. Some people benefited from a lack of commute, whereas others missed the casual interactions and the face-to-face collaboration that you would get in an office setting. Similar trends were seen for essential workers, as shown in this cartoon from a recent WATF conference. Essential workers were more likely to report an increase in productivity. But non-essential workers, or those who didn't know what their status was, were more likely to report a decrease in well-being. And this perhaps suggests that communication and the uncertainty that arises from that can really negatively affect well-being. So this slide shows the 8 most prevalent themes that came through in the survey. Working from home was the main form of adaptation, and it was also seen as a large part of the new normal for the future, but it was still seen as a significant challenge to overcome. Communication largely focused on the guidance that water companies sought from regulators. They wanted more guidance on compliance, but they also wanted understanding regarding regulation, penalties, rewards, and particularly in relation to ODIs. Finance included impacts on individuals, so this was things like job losses, but also the ability to pay their water bills, and the cost burden or the potential cost burden on water companies due to the change in wastewater load and the decrease in revenue arising from the change in water use from primarily metered commercial buildings to domestic homes, many of which are unmetered. IT issues were a really key challenge at the beginning of the pandemic, but these were reported to have been resolved quite quickly. And site work raised primarily logistical constraints in the first national lockdown, when there were concerns over how work could take place if individuals couldn't travel out of an area or stay overnight anywhere. Finally, there was quite a few participants that noted a disruption of this scale really presented an opportunity to embrace the circular economy, to reduce emissions, and to commit to a much greener recovery. So we analysed the findings in terms of mitigation, adaptation, coping, and learning. Most participants thought the crisis plans developed were adequate to cope with a single threat, and that Brexit preparations had contributed to this. But there were questions over what impact multiple threats, such as a significant drought at the same time as the pandemic, might have had on the system. The key learning from the survey highlighted the importance of robust IT systems and good communication. But many suggested that future crisis plans should learn from this and prepare for prolonged crises, as well as those of international magnitude, and that these should be developed collaboratively across multiple sectors and prepare for the likelihood of multiple threats occurring simultaneously. So we followed the initial survey up with 11 semi-structured interviews with senior level individuals from 10 different water companies. We wanted to find out what they had done to mitigate the threats of a pandemic, what planning had been carried out to assess the vulnerability of water systems, if any other large-scale threats had been experienced during this time, and how that had affected their ability to respond. The interviews were conducted over a period of reasonably relaxed restrictions in the summer, but up until the UK re-entered lockdown at the beginning of November. And COVID-19 was found to be a threat multiplier. Reduced rainfall and higher than average temperatures that we saw, particularly around May, increased the complexity of the effects that were realised. And it really tested the reliability, the sustainability, and the resilience of organisations, systems, and networks. It also highlighted pre-existing vulnerabilities in water systems. So we mapped out the threats, system failures, and impacts and consequences on something that's known as a ripple effect map, which is the diagram that is shown on this slide. And what we saw was repeated modes of failure. So if you look at this diagram, I don't expect you to be able to read the detail in that. This is a paper that we are preparing for publication, and hopefully you'll be able to read it then. But what you should be able to see is that there is a larger proportion of the system failures and impacts than there is of kind of the threats and the consequences. So if we look at the amount of red and blue squares, and that's simply because we're not finished with the pandemic yet. Some of the consequences, the purple squares, haven't been realised yet, or they weren't discussed in the interview. On top of that, within each ripple, each one of the black circles, you can see sometimes there is one failure directly triggering another failure before triggering an impact. And this is known as a cascading failure, and it highlights the complexity of the system and the situation that we found ourselves in. So despite this, the overall view remains that the sector did well to respond to the pandemic and maintain performance of critical assets during exceptional conditions. There was interest for continuing to actively pursue cross-industry collaboration. And as with the survey, there was an acknowledgement that this posed a real opportunity to reevaluate traditional working practices and environments. So whilst pandemic plans were considered to be good enough, or adequate, I suppose, as they were described in the survey, they were inconsiderate of the scale of the crisis and perhaps require reevaluation in the face of the scale of the challenges that are still yet to come. So lastly, I'd just like to acknowledge the research team who worked on the survey and the interviews and enabled the findings of it to be analysed and shared fairly rapidly.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Sarah. Really interesting. I mean, we'll come to Q&A and I'm sure people will have lots of questions. For me, the breadth of impact is one of the really standout, factors. What single event would cause you to think about the circular economy, change your water consumption, and have an impact on your mental health all in one go? It's just huge, isn't it? So really interesting. Thank you. On to our next speaker. I'm really delighted to introduce to you Sophie Broadfield. And Sophie's going to talk about how the water sector can drive a green recovery. Sophie's responsible for the overall regulatory system for water and companies in England, overseeing the relationship with Ofwat, the economic regulator, and engagement with the water industry. She also leads on ensuring that there's a secure and sustainable supply of water in the long term, responding to population growth and climate change. Her team works closely with Water UK on the delivery of net zero by the water industry. And in previous roles, Sophie's worked in MHCLG, which I think is the Ministry of Housing and Local Government. I hope I've got that right, Sophie, on local government finance reform, and in the Treasury and Department for Education. So very warm welcome, Sophie.
Thank you very much, Nikki. And yes, you did get that right, so well done. It's a bit of a mouthful, that department name. I'm going to speak to you a little bit today about the government's invitation to water companies to play a part in the green economic recovery from COVID-19, which we are in the middle of. So I'm expecting there to be questions at the end, and we are still developing lots of our thinking with companies and regulators. I mean, the background to this is that there's been a lot that's been hugely positive from water companies in the last few years to deliver more for customers and for the environment. We've really seen a cultural shift in many ways in company corporate behaviours and responsibilities. There have been commitments to increase support for those who can't afford their bills, for example, and a really fantastic response to the COVID pandemic, where water companies massively stepped up to maintain that really crucial public service in a time of need. We also see water companies with a stronger recognition of their environmental responsibilities and a sense of social purpose. that's all really good, but there's definitely more that needs to be done. And for example, environmental performance on a day-to-day basis across the sector is really far from as good as it could be. So the response to COVID-19 is a timely opportunity for the water industry to demonstrate commitment to the local environment and social responsibility for the communities they serve. And in a speech last month to the Social Contract Summit, the Environment Minister set out her core vision for the future of the industry. And these 3 goals there on the screen have been agreed with the other regulators of the water industry. So they represent a coherent, hopefully, and consistent set of expectations of water companies, providing a safe and affordable service, of course, supporting a thriving natural environment, and fantastic support for customers with day-to-day service excellence. Post the initial first wave of COVID-19, water companies came to us and suggested that they could play a role in the green economic recovery. And so the government and regulators rapidly published a letter on the 21st of July, which is available at that link, and I'm sure that will be circulated separately, inviting companies to bring forward proposals to support the recovery. We see this as an opportunity for water companies to demonstrate their delivery of these 3 goals. And we really believe that companies have the vision and capability to meet this national challenge. The 2 things we asked for in that letter particularly were for proposals that would support our environmental objectives and that would create jobs and boost GDP. What's the response been so far? Well, it's been fantastic. We've had 9 water companies and counting, it sort of increases every few days, have talked to us about their ideas. We are looking at making some really rapid decisions to accelerate existing investments. So £2 billion of so-called AMBER water industry national environment programme schemes will be given early regulatory approval to go ahead as soon as companies can get spades in the ground. And then there have been so far a further £2.7 billion of proposals shared with us in draft, of which 1.2 billion are proposals to accelerate investment, so spend money earlier than might otherwise have been spent to help create jobs and boost recovery sooner, and 1.5 billion pounds worth of new proposals for customer investment. And I've set out some examples there of the kinds of things that we're seeing, which demonstrates the real range of types of things. So progress on storm overflows, accelerated WINEP schemes, ideas around catchment markets for environmental improvement, piloting inland bathing waters, reducing flood risk, etc., etc. The important caveat there at the bottom is that we do not expect all of these proposals to meet the criteria that we have set out and to be approved, but we really support what water companies are doing in bringing forward their best and brightest ideas for consideration. And thank you so much for those that have been involved in that, who might be on the call today. So what are the criteria? Well, we are setting a high bar and we are not apologetic for that. On the 26th of November, we have confirmed the regulatory assessment process, and it's at the same link as the one before. And there's a deadline of the 31st of January for companies to bring forward new proposals. The core goals that I set out at the beginning, those 3 goals for the water industry, were agreed, as I said, between government and water regulators. And we've done the same with the criteria here. So there are not several different assessment processes. There's one, and we commit the government, Ofwat, the Drinking Water Inspectorate, Consumer Council for Water, Environment Agency and Natural England will be working together to review the proposals that come in. But it's fair to say that proposals that involve extra costs to customers have to be considered against stringent criteria. It would be unreasonable, given the situation that we're in, for customers to bear large bill increases, even for schemes that they might strongly support. And they must be good value for money in the scheme. So we've been trying to find a balance between the ambition for the green recovery and ensuring customer bills are not unfairly impacted. So to secure additional funding, companies also need to demonstrate that they're on track with the current commitments, have explored alternative sources of funding for new schemes instead of customers, and have secured good customer support. But I've got no doubt that at the end of this, we're going to have some really great schemes that will genuinely improve the environment and boost economic recovery in their local areas, because what we've seen so far has been really good from companies. So that's the end of my presentation, and I look forward to taking questions later.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sophie. Really interesting. And for me, linkage is already appearing between the work that Sarah talked about around things like actually consumption patterns changing, and then some of those accelerated schemes I know that are being suggested around bringing in more metering, and you can already start to see how some of this could link up really nicely. So yeah, thank you. And Sophie's helpfully reminded us, if you've got any questions, then pop them in the Q&A box below, if that's all right. And then when we get to our Q&A session in around 40 minutes, we'll have plenty to talk through. Okay, on to our next speaker. So I'm delighted to introduce Lee Pitcher to you. Lee is Yorkshire Water's Head of Partnerships, and he's also the Programme Director for the United Nations recognised Living with Water project, which won the first ever British Quality Foundation's Excellence in Collaboration Award. Lee's held roles in asset management, customer service and operations, and has been involved in leading large strategic projects through managing widespread operational response to some of the biggest events over the last 2 decades. And his experience has recently lent itself to Lee being one of 3 rotational chairs at Yorkshire Water, managing the end-to-end risk associated with the pandemic. And it's that experience in particular that we're going to hear about today. So you're very welcome, Lee. Over to you.
Can you hear me, Nikki?
Yeah, we can hear you, Lee. We'll just wait for your screen to appear, if that's all right.
No problem.
Yeah, it's just happening.
What wonderful. Smashing. Thank you very much, and thank you for that very nice warm welcome, and hello to everybody here today. Okay, so I'm going to go really very much into the nuts and bolts of things now in terms of operational response. Before I do that, let me just give you a bit of a flavour as to the company I work for, Yorkshire Water. Of course, Yorkshire Water is situated in the largest county. We serve around 5 million customers every single day, collection, treatment, distribution of water, and the collection, treatment and recycling of wastewater. And I guess our vision is to help water play its really very important role now and in the future. I've got to say that water, without a doubt, is more crucial now than it probably has ever been. We produce about 1.2 billion litres every day along our 20,000 miles of pipe work, and that then goes to our wastewater treatment works. But let's remember, from a key worker point of view, from actually managing the pandemic point of view and reducing risk, water is just crucial, right the way down to actually washing our hands every day. And we know there's been some new research recently that shows that anyone that washes their hands more than 6 times a day, compared to people that wash them between 0 and 5, that reduces the risk of infection by about 36%. So hugely important. So about a year ago, Yorkshire Water stood back. We looked at our future vision, what we wanted to be in the future, and we saw and started to use a bit of research to understand what do customers see us as. And that's why I've got this Venn diagram. And I love a Venn diagram because the Venn diagram was invented in Hull, which is obviously based in Yorkshire, and I spend a lot of my time over in that particular area. So we're absolutely a private company, but I suppose most crucially and importantly, we provide the most essential public service, as I've already said, and we're so very much aware of that. The reliance on us to deliver every single day is hugely important. And of course, we also play a massive role in the community. We employ a lot of people, but we've also got huge amounts of skills and knowledge that we can deploy and support our communities with every single day. So coming on to how we've managed the risk of COVID-19. I think when you're working in such a an ambiguous environment, the key thing is that you need to have really strong governance in place, very strong early intervention. So decision making is massively important. And the way that you can make those decisions is to make sure that you've got the right people at the right time with the right amount of data and evidence to make the best possible choices in the moment. And also, when we've done that, that we understand what that means in terms of impact. And we always look at that from a people and a customer lens. And when I talk about people, I'm talking about our colleagues, because their safety has been at the heart of all that we've done. So I guess from an incident management point of view, we have a very mature process within the company that's been tried and tested on many, many occasions, whether that be for some of the great floods that we've unfortunately had, or in periods of prolonged drier weather. But I guess it's never been tested in the same way that I guess no one's ever tested something on this scale for this longer period, but it has stood us in really good stead. So if you can imagine, you have at the bottom level, business as usual, things are ticking along quite nicely. If a risk emerges, then we set up what we call a company risk management team. That's chaired by an experienced manager within the business. But I guess when you start to look at a pandemic of this size and what it really means, it's very clear that you need an extra layer of support. So the next escalated layer of support is a company incident management team. That's chaired by a senior leader from the business. We have 3 rotating chairs for that. I'm one of those. And during the height of the response, we were meeting daily, and we're now down to 2 days a week. But ultimately, we are there to make sure there's an escalated route for all of the risks that are emerging, and we are making those decisions swiftly and quickly to allow people to move on. At a very top level, though, we also have a crisis management team, and that is chaired by our CEO, Liz Barber. And we produce sit reps for that team. And again, if we feel that there is something that needs to be escalated to that level, we've got that continuous communication backwards and forwards. I suppose the key thing for me, though, that helps and supports that section there in the middle, and myself on a day-to-day basis, is that we have a lot of very, very good data coming in, whether that be from the NIM, the National Incident Management Team, where you've got representatives of regulators, other water companies, public health authorities, providing data and information on a regular basis, or whether that be through a daily dashboard that we've set up. And that, to me, is one of the most crucial things that we put in place very, very early on. So that daily dashboard, it looks at absence rates, it looks at mental health, it looks at colleague sentiment, but the other thing it does is looks at every single department within the business, and we have a break status. So we look at whether we're black, yellow, amber, or green on or red on a day-to-day basis, and we can actually focus in on areas where we've got concerns or emerging risks. In addition to that, that dashboard also incorporates all of our key end-to-end 10 end-to-end processes. So everything from accounts payable to the ability for people to phone in and speak to our service desk, through to supply chain and PPE, which was obviously a huge concern early on during the pandemic. I suppose the final thing here, though, is horizon scanning. So whilst we've got on a day-to-day basis a team that's managing the incident and things that are coming on each day, we've also got another group of senior managers looking forwards 3 months, 6 months and 12 months into the future. What does it mean in the future around workplace and workplace experience? What learning is coming out of working from home on a more regular basis in terms of how do you manage that for a sustained period of time? So it's we've got this very, very good dual process going on where we are managing the day-to-day, but we are also looking at the future and feeding that learning back into the day-to-day on a regular basis. And I just wanted to give you a flavour of some of the things that we do look at in terms of our key triggers. So of course, NIM, I've already mentioned, if there's any movement there in terms of their break status reporting, that would mean that we would escalate and bring us together on a more regular basis. If our resourcing levels dropped anywhere, or sorry, moved up above 10%, again, that would mean a different focus and a different look on what we needed to do. I suppose the big thing here, though, for me, is colleague and safety. So colleague health and well-being and safety. And I'm just going to come on to that a little bit more now. So it's all well and good managing an incident, but in times like these, what people really need is peace of mind. And our big ambition in the company is always to put people at the heart of everything that we do. And when we talk about people, that's in the broadest sense, so our colleagues and our customers. So in order to make sure that they had peace of mind so that they could come to work and carry on doing their job and supporting the communities that we serve, we committed really, really early on to all of our colleagues that during that lockdown, that we would absolutely be not looking to furlough anyone. We made sure that was really clear, and we communicated that very early on. We also did, though, was we adopted and shared a 24-hour advice line for our colleagues through our occupational health team. We've got a great occupational health team at Yorkshire Water, but it's a confidential advice line. It shares guidance on loads of areas that go far beyond just mental health. We have advice around finances, bereavement, and medical advice separate to what's going on in terms of COVID impact. But we also did was we signed up and shared free access for colleagues to something called Together All, which is an anonymous forum. It's online and it's supported by a whole host of professional counsellors. People can join that, they can share, they can discuss, they can comment on any issues that they've got. And it just allows them to have that place that they can go to if they want to keep their anonymity. That's hard to say, Nikki, try that one in a second, and know that they've got the support there. We've got about 300 mental first aiders across the business. All of them put their names forward, volunteered to support at any time, which again, you know, some people don't want to go to professional services, but just need to know that they've got a colleague there that they can talk to if they were just overwhelmed. We held childcare support sessions for parents. And again, that plays back to what Sarah said at the beginning in terms of some of those concerns that people had in terms of childcare. And it was nice and to know that there was a network of support there for those people. I suppose the other thing, though, is what we're aware of. It's not just about our colleagues, but their families were also quite naturally going through some really, really challenging and tough times. So in terms of financial stability during this period, we launched an interest-free £1,000 loan for colleagues that their families could access if they were in need or were being massively affected by COVID-19. And we also have got existing partnerships, for example, with Leeds Credit Union, where people can take out personal loans as well if they wanted to. The other thing for me is that we wanted to really praise and recognise some of that great work that was going on out there with, you know, in that wonderful cartoon again that Sarah showed at the beginning. You saw that some people fed back that they felt that the water services were just not seen throughout this. So recognition for us was really, really important because we wanted to know and tell people that we recognised that they were our own heroes. So there was a whole programme around recognising colleague heroes, and if they won that, we would then donate money to charity. I guess, Nikki, I'm going to stop there. I could go on forever, but thank you very much.
Oh, Lee, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. It's great to hear. And who knew that Venn diagram was invented in Hull? Like, I said I learned things on these seminars, but like I was not expecting that. So thank you so much, Lee. And you know, I have a conflict of interest. I have to declare, Lee and I used to work together and I live in Yorkshire, and so I've sort of seen the work that Yorkshire's done firsthand, really. And I'm sure it's been echoed across all of the water sector. The care that the sector is taking of its people as well as its customers is really lovely to see. So thank you, Lee. One quick reminder, we've got a Q&A, which is great. We've seen a few on the chat. If you can pop those on Q&A, that'd be really helpful. but we've got a good amount of time to speak to a fantastic group of speakers, and I've got loads of questions, but you don't want to hear mine, so or not just mine anyway, I'm sure. So if you have got any questions for our speakers, pop them in the Q&A box for me, and in around 25 minutes we'll come to all of those. So I'm going to hand over to our next speaker, and that's Daniel Johns. And Daniel is the head of public affairs at Anglian Water. Anglian, for those of you who aren't in the UK, is the largest water company in England, supplying around 6 million customers, and that's the region between the Thames and the Humber estuary, where Lee is actually. Daniel was previously a senior civil servant at the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, DEFRA, working on agriculture, water and flood risk management policy. And he also spent 4 years at the Committee on Climate Change, where he led the last UK climate change risk assessment. Daniel also chairs the UK Water Efficiency Strategy Steering Group, and I'm delighted to say recently joined us as a fellow of CIWEM. So Daniel, over to you.
Thanks very much, Nikki. Yeah, and so let me just move on to my first slide. There we go, fantastic, that's working. Yeah, so hi, thanks very much for inviting me to speak this morning. So I'm Head of Public Affairs at Anglian Water. As Nikki said, we're the largest water company in England and Wales. I guess what's important about that is that the East of England is also one of the most exposed both to climate change and also to kind of economic deprivation. We've got some of the most, some of the poorest communities in the country. Some of those really at an economic disadvantage because of years gone by, perhaps lack of investment in infrastructure and so forth, connecting up our communities with the kind of big growth areas in the south, in London and in Cambridge. But we also, for example, mentioning Cambridge, we also have some real economic strengths within the region. Cambridge could well become England's second city by the time we get to mid-century on the rate of current economic growth. And in response to COVID-19, in response to the pandemic, it was pretty clear early on that there were calls from across society to kind of learn the lessons from the 2007 economic crisis, the financial crash, which led to a decade of austerity, public spending budgets being cut, jobs being lost in environmental industries, very little being done to preserve nature, to reduce carbon emissions beyond the electricity sector. And a sense, not just within the water industry, but across society, that we wanted to do something different this time, not to kind of resort back to kind of job cuts and all the rest of it, but actually to invest our way out of it and to re-engineer our society so that we both respond to COVID, we create the jobs that we know we need, but also to create a different economic structure, which is much more environmentally sustainable. And so early on in the process within Anglian Water, we thought, well, we're doing a lot in the immediate kind of wake of COVID to support staff, to support our supply chain, exactly as Lee has set out. But we thought there was much more that we as a water company can be doing to support jobs and investment across the East of England. And of course, we're really delighted when we received the letter from DEFRA in July saying, setting out the opportunity to invest more to support job creations and the green recovery. But that was only one aspect of it. That was only one dimension, I suppose, so things that we thought we could do as a water company. And so we published in September our 5-point plan for a green economic recovery, which talked about these 5 high-level goals. First of all, as a water company, becoming a net zero carbon business, accelerating sustainable housing and infrastructure growth across the East of England, creating jobs, boosting skills, delivering climate change adaptation and resilience. Of course, water companies are absolutely critical both to reducing emissions, but also for preparing our regions for the impacts of climate change. And lastly, given our business, our operations are so integrated with the environment, we felt a real responsibility and a real opportunity to build back better in ways which enable nature recovery. And I thought I'd go through those just with some examples to illustrate the kinds of things that we are now doing and we would like to do more of if we can. And I guess that was also one of the points of the Green Recovery 5-point plan, that we felt that we could do a lot, but we could do so much more working in partnership with people within the region and also jointly with government in terms of the kinds of policy proposals that have been in the pipeline for some time. And maybe now, as part of the Green Recovery, it might be the right time to bring forward some of those policies to fruition. I'll get onto those in a moment. But in terms of becoming a net zero carbon business, Anglian Water committed to go carbon neutral by 2050 back in 2016. and as part of an industry-wide commitment through Water UK, actually accelerated that to say we will become a carbon neutral business, a net zero carbon business by 2030. And last month, Water UK published on behalf of the industry the world's first kind of detailed sector level route map to reduce our emissions to zero by 2030. And on the screen there, you've got some examples of what we've already done. So the top left is our Grathram solar farm that we switched on in September. On the right is an absolutely massive greenhouse, which is heated by the waste heat from the local wastewater treatment works, the water recycling centre. It's just outside Norwich, and that's going to grow some crazy proportion of the UK's tomatoes when the greenhouse is completed. At the bottom left, we've got a carbon-free form of concrete. So some of the net zero goal be achieved by incremental change, but a lot of it is about completely re-engineering the way in which we design and build things in virtual reality. We've got at the bottom there, using data and artificial intelligence to manage our networks much more intelligently, so they become more energy efficient and less carbon intensive. And also to think about how we can deliver things through nature-based solutions, not building assets at all, which of course is the most important thing we can do by not just resorting to concrete and steel, but resorting to kind of nature-based approaches to resolve our kind of engineering challenges. In the second slide, I wanted to kind of bring in the jaws of death. So James Bevan talked about the jaws of death last year at a speech at the WaterWise conference, and this is our version of it, which for us is really quite stark. As you can see, it's not a case of potentially being in the jaws of death within 20 or 25 years, but actually within 5 years, both as a consequence of the climate change that we've already experienced, historic climate change there on the left-hand side, but also because we've been asked and actually have agreed to quite significant sustainability reductions in our abstractions. So this is where we have voluntarily agreed with the Environment Agency to cap our licenses at peak historic flows. And the consequences of that are quite stark. It takes us toward the kind of a position of not having sufficient headroom within the next 5 years, unless we invest in things like smart metering. We've got a major bulk pipeline that stretches now, starting to be built from the Humber estuary down into the Midlands and out into to Cambridge and out into the east. So there's a whole series of investments we're making over the next 5 or 10 years to resolve these jaws of death. But certainly what we want to avoid happening within the east of England is water becoming a constraint to growth. So as part of the 5-point plan, we set out a number of policy requests of government, which we've been talking to them about for some time, and hopefully there'll be some good news on these within a couple of months. But certainly the most cost-effective way of reducing kind of water consumption across the country is to introduce a water label on water-using fixtures and bathroom fittings and so forth, dishwashers, washing machines, taps and showers. And in doing so, that will help reduce the carbon footprint of households as well, because about 20% of a household's greenhouse gas footprint is because of heating water for taps and showers and so forth. The second step, which I hope again will be confirmed very soon, is that building regulations for new homes should be tightened to 100 litres per person per day, down from the optional tighter standard of 110 at the moment. But that's not enough, certainly within the kind of water-stressed parts of the east of England, where we're expecting really quite significant rates of new housing growth, for example, in that ARC growth area between Oxford and Cambridge. That at the moment, the National Planning Policy Framework prevents local councils going further on water efficiency than that 110 standard. So we want to see greater flexibility for local councils where there's a really particular need in terms of water scarcity and growth levels to set what we call a water neutrality requirement. So that means that new housing growth can be delivered without taking any extra water from the surrounding natural environment. And you do that through water efficiency, through grey water recycling, and also by offsetting any residual water use through water efficiency projects in local social housing, hospitals, schools, and so forth. So it's a real win-win, reducing water use within the wider community, reducing water bills, and not having any impact on the water environments. The next one, of course, is in direct response to the letter that Sophie mentioned. We think we can bring forward more investment, both in things like our smart meter rollout, which is already underway. We've already got the contracts in place, and for additional funding, we're suggesting about £100 million. We can install another 500,000 smart meters between now and 2025. And we can also, if we fit telemetry, remote monitoring control systems, artificial intelligence, data systems, we can manage both our water and our wastewater networks much more intelligently and optimize those for carbon, for energy, for performance, for leakage. We can prevent pollution incidents. We can do any number of things if we build a smart water network that we know we're going to need in the future. It's in the plans for AMP8. Why not bring that forward to AMP7 and get going with it now? All of these schemes will be delivered through SMEs, UK-based SMEs, some of which have been forced to rely on furlough. And so we can create those green jobs, we can test those technologies, we can bring down the costs and get it rolled out across the whole industry. The fourth area, I say, is we don't necessarily see ourselves anymore as just a water company. We're an energy company. We're one of the biggest energy producers in the east of England now. We see ourselves as a natural capital company, resolving some of those challenges on the natural environment and building natural capital assets where we can. And this is an example of that, our future Fenland scheme. So this is a kind of, if you zero in on the wash, essentially, which is the kind of top right-hand side of this diagram, we know we'd need a reservoir in this part of the country. And naturally, that would be a reservoir for the public water supply, and that would kind of be the end of the story. But because this area is so low-lying, it's really at risk of flooding from rivers, from the sea, and also from surface water. We think we can use that reservoir to manage water levels in the major rivers within that part of the world, that we can help deliver improved flood resilience for some really economic deprived parts of the country, in towns like Wisbech, where housing development is on hold because of those quite severe levels of flood risk. So how can we use water in an integrated way to manage water resource challenges, also resolve flood risks, and unlock that investment in new roads, new transport links, new housing development, let's say in the Fenland region, which at the moment has got some of the highest levels of deprivation in the country. And finally, as Sophie said, we want to bring forward those schemes within our Water Industry National Environment Programme, the WINEP programme, which are currently on hold because we've got the funding to deliver them. That's not the problem. The problem is that the Secretary of State needs to sign those schemes off. That was due to happen next year, but that's now slipping. And we've made the case as part of our green recovery proposals to have those schemes signed off straight away. For us alone, for Anglian Water, it's £300 million. Those schemes are protecting and improving 1,400 kilometres of rivers across the country. And within our programme is 34 new water treatment wetlands, like the one you've got on your screen. So this is in Gouldsthorpe in West Norfolk, which is a series of 4 gravity-fed lagoons, which take effluent from the traditional kind of water recycling centre and provide that additional kind of polishing, cleaning, stripping ammonia and phosphates in natural ways before the water is returned to the local chalk stream. We've got one, we've proven it works, it's been award-winning, it's a fantastic resource now, and we want to do another 34 of those as soon as the AMBER schemes are signed off.
Daniel, I'm sorry to interrupt you, and I know you've just got a little bit more to go through, but I'm really mindful of time. Would you mind if we paused at that point, and the extra bits that we've not talked through, perhaps we can bring into the Q&A session, if that's all right?
Yeah,
just to make
course,
sure we
yeah,
give. Wonderful, thank you. It's really interesting. I could listen to it all day, and the concept of water neutrality is really interesting in terms of how do we make that part of the kind of language in the same way that we talk about carbon neutrality. I think is fascinating. I'm also slightly concerned as a proud Brummie that you think Cambridge might be England's second city, but we'll deal with that offline. Delighted to welcome Francis. He's going to bring his experience of leading the National Infrastructure Commission's resilience work and talk about recommendations for long-term resilience. Francis is a chartered engineer and a principal consultant in climate and resilience at Atkins. He was previously the National Infrastructure Commission's technical lead for water and environment, and this year was a lead contributor to the NIC's resilience study. His experience includes advisory, design and project management in the UK, Australia and Asia Pacific, including strategic planning for water and wastewater, natural capital, economic appraisal and climate adaptation for infrastructure. He's got a master's in engineering for sustainable development from Cambridge. I'm not sure when he finds time to sleep, but I'm delighted to welcome Francis.
Thank you, Nikki. Okay, great. So the National Infrastructure Commission, for those that don't know, is the government's impartial expert advisor on long-term infrastructure challenges. And back in May, in the middle of the pandemic, the NIC published its study on the resilience of the UK's infrastructure systems. So I was fortunate to be a lead contributor to the study, and the study looked at 4 different infrastructure sectors, which were power, transport, telecoms, and water and wastewater. So my background's in water and environment, so I'll focus today on water. And I'll talk about some of the key findings from the study and the 3 recommendations we made to government. And I'll reflect on how the water sector has performed fairly well and learnt from past disruptions and is continuing to learn from COVID. Great. So the first point to make that we reflected on the study, so we conducted a lot of analysis in-house in the study at the NIC, and we also had external consultants, and we spoke to a range of different stakeholders across the sector and also gauged the public's views on resilience. And we looked at a couple of key case studies, which I've got a few notes on here. And we saw that in the water sector, there's really robust and mature planning for drought resilience and for water resources. But we saw there are some gaps in other disruptions that have occurred, and the water sector has learnt from these, but we've seen that planning and coordination for a different range of vulnerabilities hasn't always been as strong as it has been for drought resilience. So just to make the point that we're not saying that we can prevent all disruptions, but being resilient doesn't mean just preventing disruptions, it means responding and recovering. So the first point there is that the water systems are vulnerable to a range of shocks and stresses. The next point to make is that water systems depend on other infrastructure services and other services in our economy, such as financial systems. So some examples here are the water sector. It can't be resilient without the resilience of its dependent sectors as well. So power, transport, telecoms, for instance. So we saw a major power outage in the UK last year in August, but the water sector performed quite well during this period because of coordinated planning and redundancy built into water systems power supplies as well. Whereas we saw the rail network was severely impacted during the power disruptions. So the water sector performed quite well. And the other example I've got here is preparations for Brexit. So when Brexit was announced, the water sector went into quite a state of panic in terms of continuity of supply for critical chemicals for water treatment, as well as critical components for water systems. But with coordinated planning and coming together and developing contingencies and putting focus in this area, the water sector's developed really robust plans for continuity of critical supply, as well as redundancy measures and buffer capacity. And those sorts of plans have made the water sector more resilient during the COVID-19 pandemic. So the other thing to point out here is that the water sector can be resilient through all of its planning on its own, but it also needs to consider the interdependencies. So other sectors rely on water, and this is becoming even more apparent. So of course, we know with agriculture and industry and energy are all very reliant on water, and this is only growing. In terms of energy in particular, with the advent of hydrogen technology and carbon capture and storage, we see there's a growing demand for water. And so we can't be resilient by thinking in silos. We need to consider the interdependencies across infrastructure sectors and across sectors in our economy. And so that brings me to the 3 key recommendations that we made to government from the study. The first one is that government should set resilient standards for infrastructure services, and that they should review these standards every 5 years. The second one is that infrastructure operators, so in this case, we're talking about water companies should stress test their systems, and this should be overseen by the regulators, Ofwat and the Environment Agency, and water companies should address any vulnerabilities that are identified. And our third recommendation was that water companies should develop long-term resilience strategies, and that Ofwat should take these into account during price reviews. So the 3 recommendations work together as setting or providing a framework for enhancing resilience. The first recommendation is about setting standards, and we see a role here for government because there's a role in prioritising and trading off different objectives when setting a standard. So the government has to balance things like affordability and look at the costs and benefits of different standards to understand what's achievable and what's desirable in the scheme of other objectives, such as achieving net zero and achieving levelling up and other priorities. So we have seen the government step up and do this well in some areas, and we're really thrilled with the recent National Infrastructure Strategy, where the government has committed to a 1 in 500 year drought resilience standard, because that sends a clear signal to regulators and to water companies, which will be funded and which will be operationalised. So we can see that that's an example of setting standards. But not all standards need to be hazard specific. They could also be hazard agnostic. So an example there is a recovery standard. So it wouldn't matter what kind of event or disruption causes a loss of service, for instance, but a recovery standard would mean that customers and businesses have confidence that the services will be restored within a period of time. So that's another example of the type of standard that we could see there under a resilience standard. So in the second recommendation, this is about water companies demonstrating they can meet those standards that the government has set. And if they can't meet those standards, it's about addressing vulnerabilities and ensuring that they are resilient under the current situation. And then the third recommendation is saying that while water companies might be resilient today, this doesn't guarantee that they'll be resilient in the future. So we need water companies to develop adaptive plans, and we need water companies to understand the key decision points that they'll need to consider in order to adapt their systems to be fit for the future and future customer needs. And we also need resilience to be properly valued. So that's about understanding the benefits of resilience and having that valued and funded in the regulatory system. So along with these 3 recommendations, we developed a framework for the 6 aspects of resilient infrastructure systems. And the way we saw it was starting with anticipate. And this is where systems can anticipate shocks and stresses, moving into resist and absorb, to recover, and then to adapt and transform. So I think most of those are self-explanatory, but just to point out the differences between adapt and transform. So adapting, we see that as taking existing systems and incrementally improving, or even a step change improvement of existing systems to meet future needs and future challenges. Whereas transform, we saw as a different aspect, and that could be creating new systems or regenerating systems, or even regenerating business models to meet future needs and take advantage of opportunities. So I'll make that a little bit more tangible by giving some examples of where companies have invested in these aspects to build resilience, and also connect this to COVID-19. So in Anticipate, these are investments in things like monitoring the performance of systems and monitoring the condition of assets and monitoring weather conditions, for instance, but also monitoring customer demand and customer behavior. So we saw during COVID-19 that companies have invested in monitoring their systems performed well in terms of understanding when there were changes in demand or changes in operation or sewer blockages, for instance. Certainly investments in managing demands such as smart metering and leakage reduction have significantly helped companies manage water resources and demand through the dry period of lockdown as well. And anticipating is also about coordinating planning with stakeholders and other sectors. So we've seen, as I pointed out, that the water sector's learned from Brexit here and learned from other failures, and that's put them in good stead for COVID-19. Under resist, this is investments in things like weatherproofing our systems, or in building defences to floods and even cyber defences, for example. Under absorb, this is investments in things like buffer capacity and interconnectivity of water supplies. So again, this was really critical during the very high demand period seen during May in lockdown, where companies called on reserve suppliers or were able to have the flexibility in their networks to draw from different water supplies. Under recover, this is about investments in response teams, insurance and environmental rehabilitation. So we definitely saw during the pandemic that people and response teams are absolutely critical. So people, operators and water company workers and even the supply chains are just as important as the infrastructure itself in terms of continuity. And then lastly, investments in improving, continuous improvement, learning lessons and having optionality and flexibility to adapt as the future unfolds. So I'll just sum up by saying the key recommendations from the NIC to the government are that government needs to set resilient standards, that water companies need to stress test their systems and develop long-term resilient strategies. And we see a key role here for government, regulators and water companies to step up and meet the challenges of the future, as well as taking on the opportunities of green recovery and levelling up. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Francis. That was brilliant. Really interesting. You said something that I've just tweeted because I couldn't agree more, which is you can't be resilient by thinking in silos. And I mean, I would say that because my theme for the year is everything is connected, but I'm totally on board with that. I think you're absolutely right. So we're going to, in a moment, turn to our questions to the panel. So if I can ask my panelists who are turning cameras on to turn cameras back on for me. Before we do that, I just wanted to remind, or for anyone that's joined late, just so you know, we're going to finish at 10:58. so that anyone that wants to can join in with a minute's silence to remember Brian, Luke, Ray and Mike from Wessex Water, who tragically lost their lives at Avonmouth last week. And I know as a sector, we've been impacted by that. Okay, so let's turn our questions to the panel. Thank you very much for those of you that have sent them in. I'm just going to open my screen here. Okay, so the great thing about this is that you've upvoted them, so I don't need to do quite as much work, so thank you. Okay, guys, so the first question is from Nathan Richardson, and I know Nathan works for WaterWise. So panel, we've not heard much about customers. Has there been any pushback from metered household customers getting higher bills during COVID? And Annabelle, you talked recently about that shift from, in essence, business demand's been outsourced to household demand, hasn't it? And suddenly people are using the water that their employer might normally pay for. And Nathan's saying, has the sector introduced any new measures to specifically help that, such as a COVID price rise cap? So probably it's a Daniel or Lee question to begin with from a water company perspective, unless anyone else wants to jump in and take it.
I'll come in first there, Nikki.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. Perfect. Thank you.
Customers have been at the heart to be really, really clear on that, of course, because ultimately most of our colleagues that work at Yorkshire Water are customers as well of Yorkshire Water, and that'll be the same, I guess, right the way across the country. So we've been very, very thoughtful around what we need to do to support our customers through this period. So I guess the main thing is that we've reached out to all of our customers. We've promoted a lot of the various schemes that you can imagine that we already had in place, but people maybe weren't as aware of, but have become more aware of the need for them during this period. So they've got lots of short-term and longer-term support. So from a short-term point of view, we've looked at payment holidays, and we've given payment holidays. We've got schemes where if people have got medical conditions, short or long-term, that we can support them and their families through that period. We've got schemes where we can support people where they may have some growing debt, and how we can help them with their payments to either reduce those. And in some cases, obviously, we've got a huge amount of different social tariffs as well to even stop some payments completely and support them during the period. So a huge amount of work going on in the sector to support, and of course that is shared on a national point of view through various national organisations as well, that then gets fed back out as best practice to the other water companies. Thanks, Lee. That's really helpful. Daniel, did you want to come in as well and add on anything to that?
Well, just to say that it's absolutely an issue we're alive to. It's clear, obviously, it's going to take some time for those meter readings to come in to then be fed through into bills. So this is something that's going to unfold, I suppose, over the next kind of 6 to 12 months. But as Lee says, there's lots of support available from every water company for customers who are struggling to afford their bill. And obviously in the Anglian region, there's not such an issue between metered and unmetered customers, because we've got about 90% of our customers on a metered tariff already. But it does stress the importance of metering. Yeah, hopefully, again, as part of the personal water consumption reforms coming through next year, there might be more to say about metering being rolled out across elsewhere in the country.
Interesting.
Maybe just to add to that, the other side of the perspective. So in water, we've got a revenue cap over 5 years. So what that means is, if one area kind of contributes less, which is currently happening with the non-households, then there is a gap, and there's a question around kind of, how do we recover that gap over the 5 years? So I think it just raises lots of different questions. I think all the companies are trying to support customers as much as possible, but at the same time, yeah, we do need to kind of think about things like bill stability, and at what point and when and how some of that revenue then gets recovered.
That's really interesting. Thank you. I'm delighted, Sophie, somebody's bringing you a cup of tea. That's great service, isn't it? Nobody's bringing me a cup of tea. Actually, there's just a follow-up that's popped in from Robin that I'm interested to just whether anyone can pick up on it. He's just said, is it actually the water company's problem? And I guess, if you work from home, I work from home for a long time, and actually the electricity that you use and all those other things, sometimes it's the employer's responsibility to pick some of that up. I don't know whether you've got a view on that, guys. And obviously for some people, there isn't an employer, so they've just got increased consumption. But is there a responsibility more broadly than the water companies, do you think, here to tackle some of that? I don't know if anyone wants to come in. I know that's not really your genre, but I just thought it's an interesting point, isn't it, to raise as to whether it's just the responsibility of the water sector. Everyone's like, no, I'm not answering that. That's fine.
I think, I mean, just as a personal view, I think it is really
Yeah.
important, because all these companies saying, oh, we could save money by not having so much office space. But I think you do need to think about, do you create lots of private costs for people with utility bills, but also with people wanting to have an extra room to work from, a study and all that. So I think we could be shifting costs from companies to employees and have to be careful with that.
It's an interesting debate. I'm not going to draw you on it anymore, guys. That's fine. I love the uncomfortable. Oh my goodness. Right, let's move on to the next one. So there's a question for Daniel in the first instance from Renuka. Renuka, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Will Anglian adopt water reuse systems associated with new development schemes to achieve water neutrality? And have you got any good examples of those sort of schemes for both potable and non-potable work?
Yeah, thank you. So there are one or two examples of water neutral developments around. They're mainly to do with retrofit projects, actually, rather than new development. And we've been trying to push this, to be fair, for the last couple of years, both, not just water neutrality itself, just to get to rainwater harvesting and green water recycling. And the problem we keep coming up against is that there are no regulatory incentives for developers to actually adopt these systems. Where there are projects like the Eddington project just outside Cambridge, it's because the landowner really wants to deliver exemplary development from an environmental point of view. Water's too cheap. The payback period on green water recycling is so long that no developer, no customer would ever want to pay for it themselves. So from our perspective, it has to come through the regulatory system, through the planning system, because the wider public benefits of green water recycling just aren't factored into the price of water. So we say that it should be developed through like a water neutral requirement within local plans, or through building regulations forcing that per capita consumption target down to the level whereby green water recycling becomes necessary.
Interesting. Does anyone else want to?
Just to add to that, Nikki, I suppose some of the work that we're doing over in Hull and East Riding with the Live with Water project. So we've been working with Hull City Council to put in a new supplementary planning document that is I guess consistent criteria and guidance for new development in order to look at what they do when they're building new homes, specifically around surface water management, and the use of the use of separate systems and runoff rates and so on. So that's the first time I think that's probably been done in the country, to have that very, very clear, consistent guidance between the water authority and the local authority. So we'll see how that goes. We're going to monitor that over the next coming months. Yeah,
really interesting stuff. I think my toilet does recycling. The little sink on the top of it goes into the system, and it's a really small thing, but actually always generates lots of interest when people come. Nobody comes to your house anymore, do they? But what I was struck by, I saw them in Japan years ago, but they're really difficult to get. And for me, there's also something about, from a homeowner perspective, if you want to make some of those choices, then actually how's the, it's a small thing, but actually little things add up, don't they? What's also the market doing to actually support, as well as the large scale schemes and new developments, but actually from an individual perspective, how do we make it easy for people to retrofit and it not be much more expensive? So anyway, overshared about my toilet. Thanks for bearing with me. Okay, so let's come to the next question from Peter Melville Shreve. It's a kind of question / comment. So gosh, Lee and Daniel are just getting them all today, aren't they? Sorry guys, the rest of you can just have a bit of a rest. So Peter's talking about hand washing and sort of saying at the University of Exeter Engineering Labs, they've got a data platform monitoring hand basin versus toilet usage. Look back at the data, found that Boris's request to wash our hands was largely heeded in February. Perhaps we could look again now to see if this effort or trend has since fallen away. And I guess more generally on the kind of consumption piece, I know not all meter reads are in, but for those meters that are smart meters and where you've got AMR reads, are we seeing data that's, I guess, what does that, what's the COVID impact looking like on consumption? Have you got a sense of that from any of you?
So can I come in? Yeah, so obviously everyone's seen the big shift in water consumption from offices, gyms, hotels to personal consumption. That means it's going to be very difficult for water companies to achieve their per capita consumption targets, not just now, but to be honest, for the next couple of years. RPC, for example, PCC has gone up from about 135 litres per person per day to over 145 litres per person per day. And as you say, we are installing smart meters now at the rate of about 700 meters per day. to get towards 800,000 by the end of 2025. But of course, we don't know within that what that water is being used for. So it would have to be more detailed studies to back up the kind of smart metering data that we're now getting hold of.
Interesting. I heard the Australian. Oh, sorry, Lee, go for it.
I think you was going to say something similar to what I was going to say there, Nikki. We're on the same wavelength. But from a global point of view, we've been part of the City Water Resilience Framework assessment, working with 5 other cities across the world. So Miami, Cape Town being one of them. So Miami, Cape Town, Amman, and Mexico City. But Cape Town, obviously, potentially first world country that's going to run out of water from a drought point of view. Got very close to it last year. But I think there's a lot of learning that we now need to, once we go over this major bit of the crisis, start to look outwards and have a look at the learning that's out there in other cities across the world, because Cape Town have dramatically reduced their water consumption per household, per head. And a lot of the way that they've done that is by making data visible and allowing people to see what their contribution is at a household level to the overall picture. And by publishing that data on a regular basis, it's just made a huge difference. They've done something that, Australia's been working on for the last 20 years. They've done that pretty much overnight, just totally changed their behaviours and culturally that value in water a lot differently.
Yeah, valuing water feels like something I am hearing increasingly. And how do we get customers to value not just the water that comes out of their tap, but actually everything that's associated with that? And we were going to say something similar. I listened to an Australian Water Association podcast, and I think Sydney Water have been doing some work looking in detail, haven't they, at the consumption and trying to work out what devices from just the trends in consumption and the flow rate are using it. So actually, without needing individual meters on showers and things within houses, trying to get a sense of what water's being used for, and then how to nudge behaviour. I guess the challenge is making it stick, isn't it, as well, really? So interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm gonna. Oh, sorry. Did Francis go for it? Yeah.
Oh, I just wanted to put in that the NIC has a recommendation to government that we see metering as a critical part of water resilience. We don't think the water sector can be resilient into the future without mandatory metering into the 2050s. So I just think that if we're talking about making behaviours change stick, we've got good evidence to show how metering does mean that behaviour changes stick. So I think that's an important point to make.
Yeah, no, interesting. Thank you. And Francis, I'm really pleased you came in. I'm going to do something that I'm not meant to do as a chair, and I'm going to nip down and not pick the next question for a second. So forgive me, Ismail. I'm going to come back to it, but I'm really conscious that we've not heard so much from Sophie and Francis and Annabelle, and this one might be, well, certainly for you, Sophie. Somebody said, how have regulators responded to COVID-19 and kind of lessons learned? And I just wondered if you wanted to give us a little bit of insight into DEFRA, Sophie. That'd be great.
Thanks very much for the question. Well, initially, a big part of our response was working really closely with the water companies to try and identify regulatory measures that needed to be stepped back for a period to support companies to focus on the day job, the core function. So that was things like the Drinking Water Inspectorate, relaxed requirements to go into people's homes and test drinking water. We also did things, loads of really interesting troubleshooting that needed to be done at the time, like facilitating a conversation with the Pubs Association about how to dispose of all that beer. That was mentioned at the beginning in one of the presentations. So I think the really good relationships we have with the water companies, which come a little bit out of planning for EU exit, were really tested but shown to work really well. And the water companies, as I say, had a really good system for bringing together their issues and then escalating that to water regulators who could quickly respond. More recently, then, the subject of my presentation was obviously, as a group, we've been trying to work together more consistently to both be clear about what our expectations are of water companies, and then to invite green recovery proposals and assess them together to allow for accelerated investments, which is not normally what the regulators do very well, potentially to allow for increased investment by customers too, where that stands up to scrutiny. And this is all quite unprecedented. I don't think we've done it before that way. And I hope that we can learn from this approach and take it forward to more standing items of regulation. So the way we approach price reviews, for example, in future.
That's really interesting. One of the things I was wondering is what will stick, what will we kind of double down on? What are the things that we learn in an incident but actually become the way that we do things because we realise it, it has better outcomes overall. And so it's really interesting to hear that's one of them really. That's great, thank you. And Sarah, I haven't forgotten you as well, so do jump in. It's really hard when you haven't got somebody's face in front of you, so forgive me, you are still there and I'm keen to hear from you. Right, we've got 3 minutes left, so I'm going to get through as many of these as I can. So we'll do quick fire. So Ismail's asked, what's the most significant step taken that's leading Anglian to be net zero within the water sector? There's a bit more beyond it, but I guess, Daniel, probably one for you realistically.
Yeah, sure, I've just actually answered it in the chat, but essentially any responsible business should be getting to net zero as soon as possible. You know, this is the greatest challenge that we face as a society, and no business worth its salt can really be kind of putting itself forward as a leading business unless it has a credible net zero plan.
Mm-hmm. Nice and clear, brilliant. Thank you, Daniel. So Francis, I think you're going to pick up the next one. What do you think the government, why do you think government will set drought resilient standards but not flooding ones? So for the example, the FCERN strategy letter says government doesn't think flood standards are the way forward, but does think standards for drought and other hazards should apply. Keen to hear your thoughts, Francis.
Yeah, sure. So the National Infrastructure Commission recommended to government in 2018 that the government sets a national resilience standard for flooding, a 1 in 200 year standard for flooding, and for urban centres, a 1 in 1,000 year flood resilience standard. Unfortunately, that was probably one of the key recommendations that the government hasn't adopted in their recent national infrastructure strategy. We're really pleased to see that the government has invested a record amount in flood resilience, and their new flooding and coastal erosion management strategy does make really big steps forward in terms of its plans for reducing flood risk. But we still feel at the NIC we like to know the government's long-term objectives, where what sort of resilience is being built across the country in all parts of the country, and that was the point around a national resilience standard. I think resilience, there is a journey here that the water sector has been on for some period of time, and drought resilience is increasingly understood and valued in the water sector. I think flood resilience is something that is very multifaceted. It involves lots of different players, from natural flood management to built schemes to property level resilience measures, and in terms of community resilience as well, and planning at a community level. So there's lots of different facets of resilience. It is complex, and I think it will take time, but we're glad to see the government moving in that direction.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Francis. Okay, I think we are going to start to wrap up very quickly, guys. So thank you. I'm so sorry to the next few questions. They're all really interesting, and I wish we'd got to them. My apologies that we haven't. It just leaves it for me to say really a huge thank you to all of our speakers: Annabelle, Sophie, Daniel, Lee, Francis, Sarah. I don't think I've forgotten anybody, hopefully not. There will be a survey link when this closes down. We'd love to hear your feedback on this morning's session, and let us know what works and what doesn't. We can only get better if we know that. Look out for the events that are coming on net zero and wider climate change in the run up to COP26. 26th February, we've got best practice in adaptation reporting and a webinar on water efficiency and metering. Very topical given our conversations today on the 19th of Jan. So huge thank you to all of you for joining us. Thanks to our panelists, and yeah, well, and have a Merry Christmas. Don't think it's too early to say that yet, is it? All right, thank you very much, guys. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye bye.